Hello there, and welcome to the Fairytale Castle. Today I am going to read to you the magnificent and beautiful fairy tale, The Wild Swans. It is a fairy tale about love, courage, perseverance, and fighting to the end for those you love. So let's find the fairy tale in here. Far, far away, where the swans fly to when we are having winter, lived a king who had 11 sons and 1 daughter, Elise. The 11 brothers, they were princes, went to school with stars on their breasts and swords at their sides. They wrote on gold slates with diamond pencils, and they were just as good at learning their lessons off by heart as at reading them from the book. You could tell at once they were princes. Their sister Elise sat on a little plate glass stool with a picture book that had cost half the kingdom. Yes, those children had all they wanted, but that wasn't to go on forever. Their father, who reigned over the whole country, married a wicked queen who was not at all nice to the poor children. They noticed it the very first day. There was a great turnout for the wedding all over the castle, and so the children were left to play visitors. But instead of them getting their usual fill of cakes and roast apples, the queen only gave them sand in a teacup and told them they could just pretend it was something. A week later, she sent the little sister Elise out into the country to be boarded with some farm people. And it wasn't long before she put so many ideas into the king's head about the poor princes that he had ended by never giving them a thought. "Fly out into the world and look after yourselves," said the wicked queen. "Fly in the form of big birds without voices." But all the same, she couldn't harm them as much as she would have liked to. They were turned into 11 beautiful wild swans. With a strange cry, they flew out of the castle windows away over the park and the woods. It was still early morning when they passed the spot where their sister Elise lay sleeping in the farmhouse. They hovered above her roof, twisted their long necks, and beat their wings, but no one heard them or saw them. They had to fly off again, high up into the clouds, far out into the wide world. At last they came to a big dark wood that stretched right down to the shore. Poor little Elise was left in the farmhouse to play with a green leaf. She had nothing else to play with. She pricked a hole in the leaf and peeped out at the sun through it, and this made her think she could see the bright eyes of her brothers, and whenever the warm rays of the sun shone on her cheeks, it reminded her of all their kisses. One day passed just like another, when the wind blew through the big rose bushes in front of the house. It whispered to the roses, "Can anyone be prettier than you?" And the roses nodded their heads. "Yes, Elise is." And when the old wife sat on Sundays at the door reading her hymn book, the wind used to turn over the pages and say to the book, "Can anyone be more devout than you?" "Yes, Elise is," answered the hymn book. And that was perfectly true, what the roses and the hymn book said. When she was 15, she had to go back home, and when the queen saw how pretty she was, it made her angry and full of hatred. She would have liked to turn her into a wild swan like her brothers, but she didn't dare to straight away because the king wanted to see his daughter. Early in the morning, the queen went to the bathroom, which was built of marble and decked out with soft cushions and the most beautiful rugs. And she took 3 toads, kissed them, and said to the first one, "Sit on Elise's head when she gets into the bath, so that she becomes as lazy as you." To the second one, the queen said, "Sit on her forehead, so that she may become as ugly as you, and her father won't know her. And you," she whispered to the third toad, "keep close to her heart and give her wicked thoughts to torture her." Then she put the toads into the clear water, which at once turned a greenish color. And she called Elise, undressed her, and made her go into the water. As she plunged in, one toad hopped into her hair, another onto her forehead, and the third onto her breast. But Elise didn't seem to notice anything. Directly she stood up, there were 3 puppies floating on the water. If the creatures hadn't been poisonous and kissed by the witch, they would have been turned into red roses. Though, mind you, they did change into flowers, just from resting on her head. And at her heart, she was too innocent and good for witchcraft to have any power over her. When the wicked queen saw this, she rubbed walnut juice into her till she was quite dark brown. She smeared her pretty face with nasty and smelly ointment, and let her beautiful hair get all matted. You would never have known it was the pretty Elise. So when her father saw her, he was horrified and said that this wasn't his daughter. Nor could anyone else recognize her. No one could but the watchdog and the swallows, and they were small fry, whose opinion went for nothing. Poor Elise cried, and her thoughts turned to her 11 brothers, who had all disappeared. Sadly, she crept out of the castle and walked all day across field and fen till she came to the big wood. She had no idea where to make for, but she felt so gloom and missed her brothers terribly. They too, no doubt, like herself, were roving about somewhere. She would look for them and find them. She had not been long in the wood when night fell. She had wandered far away from any road or path, and now she lay down on the soft moss, said her evening prayer, and rested her head on a tree stump. The air was very soft and still, and all around in the grass and on the moss were ever so many glowworms, shining like green fire. When she gently touched one of the boughs with her hand, the gleaming insects fell about her like shooting stars. All night she dreamt about her brothers. They were playing together as children again, writing on gold slates with diamond pencils, and looking at the lovely picture book that had cost half a kingdom. Though on the slate they no longer wrote simply knots and crosses. No, they wrote down the bold deeds they had accomplished, all they had been through and had seen. And in the picture book everything was alive. The birds sang. People came out of the book and talked to Elise and her brothers. But when she turned the page, they at once jumped in again, so as not to make a muddle of the pictures. When she woke up, the sun was already high. In fact, she couldn't really see it because the tall trees spread out their branches so thickly overhead, though the golden sunbeams played through them like fluttering gaze. There was a fresh smell of greenery, and the birds almost came and perched on her shoulders. She heard the plashing of water. There were a number of large springs that all flowed into a pond with a fine sandy bottom to it. And although there were thick bushes growing round it, there was one place where the stags had rooted out a great opening, and here Elise made her way down to the water, which was so clear that if the wind hadn't stirred the boughs and bushes, she might have thought they were painted on the bottom of the pond. So sharply was every leaf reflected there, whether it had the sun shining through it or hung completely in the shade. The moment she saw the reflection of her own face, she was horrified. It was so brown and hideous. But when she dipped her hand in the water and rubbed eyes and forehead, the white skin shone out again. After that, she took off her clothes and waded out into the fresh water. Nowhere in the world could there have been found a lovelier royal child than she was. When she was dressed again and had plaited her long hair, she went to the bubbling spring, drank from her cupped hands, and then wandered further into the wood without really knowing where she was going. She thought of her brothers and of the good God, who would certainly not forget her. It was He who made the wild apples grow food for the hungry. He who now showed her just a tree. Its branches weighed down with fruit. Here she ate her dinner, put props under the branches, and then walked on into the darkest portion of the wood. There all was so still that she could hear her own footsteps, hear every little withered leaf that was crumbled in her path. Not a bird was to be seen, not a ray of sun could pierce the dense foliage of the trees. The tall trunks stood so near to each other that when she looked ahead, it was as though she were shut in by a whole latticework of timber, set close together. Oh, here was loneliness, as she had never known it before. The night grew very dark. Not a single little glowworm gave out its lights from the moss. Sadly, she lay down to sleep. Then it seemed to her that the branches overhead were parted, and that God looked down on her with gentle eyes, and that little angels were peeping out over his head and under his arms. When she woke up in the morning, she wasn't sure whether she had dreamt it or whether it really happened. She had only gone a short way when she met an old woman with berries in her basket. The old woman gave her a few. Elise asked if she hadn't seen 11 princes riding through the wood. No, said the old woman, but yesterday I saw 11 swans with gold crowns on their heads swimming down the river near here. And she took Elise a little further till they reached a slope. The trees on its banks stretched their long leafy boughs across to each other, and where their natural growth was not enough for them to meet, there they had wrenched their roots out of the earth and leaned across the water with their branches intertwined. Elise said goodbye to the old woman and walked along the river till she came where it flowed out by the great open shore. The whole glorious ocean lay there before the young girl's eyes, but not a sail nor a boat of any kind was to be seen. However was she to get any further? She looked at the countless pebbles lying there on the beach, all of them round from the grinding of water. Glass, iron, stones, everything that was washed up had been shaped by the water. Although this was far softer than her delicate hands, it never tires of rolling, and this way it can smooth down what is hard. I will be just as tireless. Thank you for your lesson, you clear rolling waves. One day, my heart tells me, you will carry me to my dear brothers. On the washed-up seaweed lay 11 white swan feathers, which she collected into a bunch. They had drops of water on them, whether from dew or from tears, one could not say. It was lonely on the shore, but she didn't mind that, for the sea was continually changing. Yes, a few hours it might change more than the freshwater lakes did in a whole year. If a large black cloud appeared, it was as though the sea would say, "I too can look dark and threatening." And then the wind got up, and the waves showed the white of their eyes. But if the clouds shone pink, and the wind was lulled, then the sea was like a rose leaf. Sometimes it was green, sometimes white. Yet, however quietly it rested, there was always a gentle movement along the shore. Softly, the water rose and fell like the breast of a sleeping child. As the sun was about to set, Elise saw 11 wild swans with gold crowns on their heads flying towards the land. They hovered in the air, and behind the other, looking like a long white ribbon. Elise clambered up the slope and hid behind a bush, while the swans came and settled near her, flapping their great white wings. Directly the sun had sunk below the horizon, the swans' feathers suddenly fell away from them, and there stood 11 handsome princes, Elise's brothers. She uttered a loud cry, for although they had changed a lot, she knew it was them, felt that it must be them, sprang into their arms and called them by their names. And they were overjoyed when they saw and recognized their little sister, who had grown so tall and beautiful. They laughed and cried, and between them soon came to understand how wicked their stepmother had been to them all. "As long as the sun is in the sky," said the eldest, "we brothers fly as wild swans. But when the sun goes down, we get back our human shape. So we always have to be careful at sunset to have ground under our feet. For you see, if we were then flying up in the clouds, we should, as human beings, crash to our death down below. We don't live here. There's a country beyond the sea that's just as beautiful as this. But it's a long way there. We have to cross the great ocean, and there's no island on our way where we might pass the night. Nothing but a lonely little rock sticking up in the middle of it all. Just big enough for us to rest on side by side. If the sea gets up, then the spray dashes high above us. But all the same, we thank God for that little rock. There we can pass the night in our human shape, or else we could never visit our dear mother country." And here's a beautiful, beautiful painting of the 11 swans turning into beautiful young princes. Yes. For we need 2 of the longest days of the year for our flight. Only once a year are we allowed to visit our own home. 11 days are all we may stay, flying over this great wood, from which we can see the castle where we were born and where our father lives, and can also see the high tower of the church where mother is buried. Here we feel a kinship with trees and bushes. Here the wild horses gallop over the plain as we saw them in our childhood. Here the charcoal burner sings the old songs we danced to as children. Here is the land of our fathers, the place we feel drawn to, and here we have found you, our darling sister. For 2 days longer we may stay here, but then we must fly away across the sea to a glorious country, and yet it is not our own. How can we take you with us? We have neither ship or boat. If only I could set you free, she exclaimed. And they talked together nearly all night, with only 2 or 3 hours sleep. Elise was woken up by the sound of swans' wings whirring overhead. Her brothers were again transformed and were flying round in large circles. In the end, they disappeared altogether, though one of them, the youngest, stayed behind. The swan laid its head in her lap, and she stroked its white wings. They kept with each other all day. Towards evening, the others came back, and as the sun went down, there they stood in human form. Tomorrow we fly away, and dare not come back for a whole year. But we couldn't possibly leave you like this. Have you the courage to come with us? My arm is strong enough to carry you through the wood. Then surely, between us, our wings must be strong enough to fly with you across the sea. Yes, take me with you, said Elise. They spent the whole of that night making a net from the supple bark of the willow and the sturdy rushes, till it was really strong. Elise lay down on this, and as soon as the sun appeared and the brothers were changed into wild swans, they seized the net in their beaks and flew up high into the clouds with their dear sister, who was still asleep. The rays of the sun fell straight on her face, and so one of the swans flew above her head to shade her with its outstretched wings. They were a long way from land when Elise woke up. She thought she was still dreaming. So strange did it seem to her to be carried through the air high up over the sea. Beside her was a bowl full of delicious ripe berries and a bunch of tasty roots, which the youngest of her brothers had gathered and put there for her. She gave him a grateful smile, for she knew that he was the one flying just above her head and shading her with his outstretched wings. They were so high up that the first ship they saw below them looked like a white seagull floating on the water. Behind them was a great cloud, a huge mountain of cloud, and against this Elise could see the shadow of herself, and the 11 swans, looking enormous as they flew there. Never before had she seen such a splendid picture. But as the sun rose higher and the cloud was left further behind them, the shadowy picture disappeared. All day long the swans went whizzing through the air like arrows, and yet not so fast as before, because now they had their sister to carry. A storm got up, and night was approaching. Elise was terrified to see the sun going down, and still there was no sign of the lonely rock in the ocean. She fancied the swans were quickening the beat of their wings. Oh dear, it was her fault that they were not getting on fast enough. The moment the sun had set, they would be turned into human beings, crash into the sea, and be drowned. Then she prayed to God from the bottom of her heart. But still she could see nothing of the rock. Black clouds came up. Violent squalls heralded a gale. The clouds gloomed in one threatening, billowing mass like leads as they surged along with flash after flash of lightning. Now the sun had sunk to the very edge of the ocean, and Elise's heart trembled. Then, all at once, the swans darted downwards, so quickly that she thought she was falling. But the next moment they were gliding smoothly again. The sun was half below the horizon. Then, for the first time, she caught sight of the little rock underneath her. It looked no bigger than a seal sticking up its head out of the water. The sun was sinking fast. Now it was as small as a star. And then her foot touched solid ground. The sun went out like the last spark of a bit of burning paper, and there were her brothers standing arm in arm around her, though there was only just room for them and for her, and no more. The sea dashed against the rock and drenched them like a shower of rain. The sky was one continual glimmer of flame, with peal after peal of rolling thunder. But the brothers and their sister held each other's hands and sang a hymn, which they found was a comfort and gave them courage. The air at dawn was pure and still. As soon as the sun rose, the swans flew off with Elise from the islet. There was still a strong sea running, and as they gained height, the white foam on the dark green sea looked to them like millions of swans swimming on the water. When the sun got up higher, Elise saw in front of her, half floating in the air, a mountainous country with masses of ice glittering on the rocky slopes, and in the middle of it all a palace that seemed to stretch for miles, with rows and rows of bold colonnades, one above another, while down below were woods of waving palm trees and gorgeous flowers, as large as mill wheels. She asked whether that was the country they were making for, but the swans shook their heads, for what she saw was the lovely ever-changing cloud palace of the fairy Morgana. They would never dare to take a mortal in there. Elise stared across at it. Then mountains, woods, and palace all melted away, and in their place were a score of stately churches, all just like each other, with high towers and pointed windows. She fancied she heard the sound of an organ, but it was the sea she could hear. By this time she was quite close to the churches, and then they were changed into an entire fleet sailing along beneath her. She looked down, and it was nothing but a sea mist scudding across the water. Yes, it was an ever-changing scene that was spread before her. And at last she sighted the real country she was bound for. The beautiful blue mountains rose in front of her. Long before the sun went down, she was sitting on the mountainside before a large cave that was overgrown with the delicate green creepers. They looked like embroidered curtains. "Now let's see what you dream about here tonight," said the youngest brother, as he showed her where she was to sleep. "If only I could dream how to set you all free," she answered. And her mind could think of nothing else, and she prayed most earnestly to God to help her. Yes, even in her sleep, she went on praying. And it seemed to her that she flew high up through the air to Morgana's cloud palace, and that the fairy came to welcome her, looking so beautiful and dazzling, and yet so much like the old woman who gave her berries in the wood and told her about the swans with the gold crowns on their heads. "Your brothers can be set free," said the fairy, "but have you enough courage and endurance? It's true, the sea is softer than your delicate hands, and yet it can alter the shape of hard stones. But the sea doesn't feel the pain your fingers will feel. It has no heart and will not suffer the fear and agony you must endure. Do you see this stinging nettle I've got in my hand? There are lots of this kind growing round the cave where you sleep. Only these nettles and the ones that come up on the graves in the churchyard are any use. Remember that. They are the ones you must gather, though they will blister your skin. Crush the nettles with your feet, and you will be able to get flax. With this you must weave and hem 11 shirts of mail with long sleeves. Throw these over the 11 wild swans, and the spell will be broken. But one thing you must bear well in mind, that from the moment you start work, and all the time till it's finished, even if it takes years, you must never speak. The first word you utter will stab your brothers to the heart like a murderous dagger. Their lives will depend on your tongue. Whatever you do, remember this." So saying, she touched Elise's hand with the nettle. It burned like fire and woke her up. There was broad daylight, and close to where she had been sleeping lay a nettle like the one she had seen in her dream. She knelt it down in thanks to God, and then she went out of the cave to begin her work. With her delicate hands she took hold of the horrid nettles, which seared her like fire and burned great blisters on her hands and arms. But she would readily put up with this if only she could set her dear brothers free. She crushed every nettle with her bare feet and then wove the green flax with it. After sunset, her brothers came to her and were dismayed to find her so silent. They thought it was some fresh piece of witchcraft of the wicked stepmother. But when they saw Elise's hands, they realized what she was doing for their sake, and the youngest brother burst out crying. And wherever his tears fell, her pain stopped, and the burning blisters disappeared. She spent the whole night working, for she could not rest till she had freed her beloved brothers. All the next day, while the swans were gone off, she sat there by herself, and yet never had time flown so quickly. One shirt of mail was done already, and she was just beginning on the second. Suddenly a hunting horn rang out among the hills. Elise grew very frightened. Nearer and nearer came the sound. She could hear the baying of hounds. In terror she made for the cave, tied into a bundle the nettles she had gathered, and haggled and sat down on it. Just then a big hound came bounding out of the bushes, and then another, and yet another. They kept barking loudly and running to and fro. In a very short time, the whole hunt was there outside the cave. Handsomest of them all was the king of the land. He came forward to Elise. Never had he seen a more beautiful girl. "How came you here, you lovely child?" he asked. Elise shook her head, for she didn't dare to speak. The deliverance, the very lives of her brothers, were at stake, and she hid her hands under her apron, so that the king couldn't see how she had to suffer. "Come with me," he said. "This is no place for you. If you are as good as you are beautiful, I will dress you in silk and velvet, put a gold crown on your head, and you shall make your home in my richest palace." And then he lifted her onto his horse. She cried and wrung her hands, but the king said, "I want you to be happy, that's all. One day you will thank me." Then away he rode through the mountains, holding her in front of him on his horse. And the hunt came galloping after. As the sun went down, there lay the magnificent capital with its churches and domes ahead of them. And the king took her into his palace, where great fountains were playing in the lofty marble halls, and where walls and ceiling were gay with splendid paintings. But she had no eyes for any of this. Hers were filled with tears and sorrow. She resigned herself to letting the woman dress her in royal clothes, plait pearls in her hair, and draw elegant gloves over her blistered fingers. As she stood there in all that splendor, her beauty was so dazzling that the courtiers bowed still deeper before her, and the king chose her to be his bride. Although the archbishop shook his head and whispered that this pretty creature from the woods was a witch, he felt certain, who had blinded their eyes and turned the king's head. But the king wouldn't hear of it. He ordered the music to play. Beautiful painting of the hunt and the prince. Oh, the king, yes. And ordered the rarest dishes to be brought in, and the loveliest girls to dance for her. She was taken to those sweet-scented gardens, into the grandest rooms, but still no smile played about her lips, or from her eyes. Sorrow, it seemed, was all she could ever be here to. And now the king showed the way to the little room nearby, where she was to sleep. It was decked out with costly green hangings, so that it looked very like the cave that she came from. On the floor lay a bundle of flax she had spun from the nettles, and from the ceiling hung the shirt of mail she had already finished. One of the huntsmen had brought all this along with him as a curiosity. "Here you can dream that you are back in your old home," said the king. "Here is the work you were busy with. Now, with all your splendor around you, it may amuse you to call those days to mind. When Elise saw these things that were so dear to her heart, a smile played about her lips, and the blood came back to her cheeks at the thought of being able to save her brothers." She kissed the king's hand, and he pressed her to his heart, and had the church bell rung to announce the wedding. The lovely dumb girl from the woods was to be queen of the land. But then the archbishop whispered wicked words into the king's ear, though they didn't reach his heart, for the wedding was to take place. The archbishop himself had to set the crown on her head, and out of sheer spite he pressed the narrow circlet down over her forehead, so that it hurt her. And yet a heavier ring lay round her heart, sorrow for her brothers. And she never noticed the bodily pain. Her mouth was dumb, for a single word would have meant the death of her brothers. But in her eyes there lay a deep affection for the noble, handsome king, who did everything to make her happy. Every day she grew more and more fond of him. If only she dared confide in him, tell him of her suffering. But no, dumb she must remain, dumb to the end of her task. And so she used to slip away from him at night, make her way into the little private room that was fitted out like the cave, and there she wove one shirt after another. But just as she was beginning, on the 7th, she ran out of flax. She knew that the night nettles were growing in the churchyard, but she must gather them herself. How was she to get there? Oh, what is the pain in my fingers compared with this agony in my heart, she thought. I must risk it. God will not forget me. Then, as fearful of heart as though she were on some wicked errand, she stole down into the garden in the dear moonlight, went through the long avenues, out into the empty streets, till she came to the churchyard. There she saw, sitting on one of the largest gravestones, a group of frightful-looking witches, called lamias. They were taking off their rags, as if they meant to bathe. And then they clawed with their long, skinny fingers in the new-made graves, dragged out the corpses, and ate their flesh. Elise had to pass close by them, and they fastened their horrible eyes on her. But she said a prayer, gathered the stinging nettles, and carried them back to the palace. Only one person had seen her, the Archbishop. He was still up, while the others were asleep. So after all, he thought, he was right in what he suspected. Everything was not as it should be with the Queen. She was a witch, and that was how she had taken the king and all his people. When the king came to confession, he told him what he had seen and what he feared. And as the cruel words came from his lips, the carved image of the saints shook their heads as if to say, "It isn't true. Elise is innocent." But the Archbishop explained it in quite another way, and made out that the saints were witnessing against her, and that they shook their heads at her being so wicked. At that, 2 great tears ran down the king's cheeks, and his heart misgave him as he went back home. At night he pretended to be asleep, though he got no peaceful slumber, for he noticed how Elise used to steal out of bed, doing this regularly every night, and each time he went quietly after her and saw her disappear into her little private room. Day by day, his looks grew darker. Elise noticed this, but couldn't. Make out why it was. It frightened her, and how heavy was her heart when she thought of her brothers. Her salt tears ran down on the royal purple velvet and lay there like sparkling diamonds, and everyone who saw the rich splendor of her robes wished they were queen. Meanwhile, Elise had all but ended her task. Only one more shirt was to be made. But now there was no flax left, and not a single nettle. So once again, only this time would be the last, she must go and gather a few handsful in the churchyard. She was terrified at the thought of this lonely journey and of the horrible limace, but her will was as firm as her trust in God. off she went. But the king and the archbishop followed her. They saw her disappear through the iron gates into the churchyard, and as they came up to it, there were the Lammies sitting on the gravestone, just as Elise had seen them. The king turned away, for he fancied he saw her among them. Her whose head that very evening had rested against his heart. "Let the people judge her," he said, and the people condemned her to be burned at the stake. She was led away from the splendid royal halls to a dark, damp cell, where the wind whistled in through the barred window. In place of velvet and silk, they gave her the bundle of nettles she had gathered. She could lay her head on that. The coarse, itching shirts of mail she had woven would do for a blanket to cover her. But they couldn't have given her anything more precious. She set to work again with a prayer to her God. The street boys outside sang jeering songs about her. Not a soul had a kind word to comfort her. Then towards evening, close to the grating, she heard the whir of a swan's wings. It was the youngest of the brothers who had found his sister. She sobbed aloud with joy, although she knew that the coming night might well be the last she had to live. Still, for all that, her task was nearly done, and her brothers were with her. The archbishop came in to be with her during her last hour. He had promised the king to do that, but Elise shook her head and made signs for him to go. That night she must finish her task, or else everything would have been wasted. All the pain, the tears, and the sleepless nights. The archbishop went off saying the cruelest things about her, but poor Elise knew she was innocent and went on with her work. Little mice scampered about the floor, dragging the nettles to her feet to give her some help, and a thrush perched on a window bar and sang all night as cheerfully as he could to keep up her spirits. It was still only twilight. The sun would not rise for another hour, and there stood the 11 brothers at the palace gate, demanding to be taken to the king. But this couldn't be done, was the answer they got, for it was still night, and the king was asleep and mustn't be disturbed. They begged, they threatened, the guard was turned out, and finally the king himself appeared and asked what it was all about. But at that moment the sun rose, and there were no brothers to be seen, though away over the place flew 11 white swans. And now the whole populace came pouring out of the city gate, eager to see the witch burned. A poor broken-down horse pulled the cart in which she sat. She had been given a smock made of coarse sacking. Her beautiful long hair hung loose about her shapely head. Her cheeks were pale as death, and her lips moved slightly as her fingers kept weaving the green flags. Even on the road to her death, she would not give up the work she had begun. The 10 shirts of mail lay at her feet, and now she was doing the 11th, while the mob jeered at her. Look at the witch, the way she's mumbling. No hymn book for her. No, it's her loathsome. And here we see poor Elise in the cart on the way to be burned. Yes. Black magic she has got there. Take it away from her. Tear it into 1,000 pieces. And they all crowded in on her to tear up what she had made. But 11 white swans came flying down and perched around her on the cart, flapping their great wings till the crowd gave way in panic. A sign from heaven. She must be innocent, many of them whispered, though they didn't dare to say it aloud. The executioner then seized her by the hand, but she quickly threw the 11 shirts over the swans. And lo and behold, there stood 11 handsome princes. But the youngest had a swan's wing instead of one arm, for his shirt had a sleeve missing, which she hadn't had time to finish. Now I may speak, she said. I am innocent. And the people, seeing what happened, bowed down to her as to a saint. But Elise herself, after all the strain and fear and suffering she had been through, sank back lifeless into the arms of her brothers. Yes, innocent she is, cried the eldest brother. And then he told them all that had happened. And while he was speaking, a perfume as of 1,000,000 roses spread around, because every faggot from the stake had taken root and put out branches. And a high, sweet-smelling hedge stood there with crimson roses. Right at the top was a single flower of the purest white, glittering like a star. This the king broke off and laid on Elise's breast, and she awoke with peace and happiness in her heart. And the church bells all rang out of their own accord, and huge flocks of birds came flying in. The bridal procession back to the palace. No king had ever seen the like of it before. And here on the last page we see Elise on the cart, and the swans come flying in to save her. Yes. A beautiful story that brings hope through perseverance and trust in God. So, I hope you enjoyed this fairy tale reading. If you did, make sure to come back again for my next one. I hope to see you again very soon. Have a wonderful and magical sleep. Bye-bye.